Greetings. Welcome to Anti-Liars, where we always seek the truth and dispel the lies. I am your host, Howard Self. Today, our topic is an important one, and it will be the destruction of the Unification Church of Japan. Follow the money. On July 8, 2022, former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, was shot dead in broad daylight. The man who pulled the trigger was the son of a Unification Church member, a man whose family had been ground down into bankruptcy and despair by a fundraising machine that the leaders of the Unification Church built, defended, and refused to dismantle. By the time he chose his terrible form of protest, his family had already been destroyed. Abe's assassination was the terrible culmination of a fundraising system perpetuated by UC leaders. It was a system that Reverend Sun Myung Moon himself had tried to wind down, that Dr. Hyunjin Moon had tried for years to reform, and that church clerics fought tooth and nail to preserve because they were getting rich from it. If you want to understand what really happened to UC Japan, you have to follow the money. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get into it. It was never a secret that UC Japan was the financial engine of the movement. For decades, Japanese members carried the entire international body on their shoulders. Reverend Moon knew this could not last. His son, Dr. Moon, had told him more than once that it was unsustainable, both spiritually and economically. Reverend Moon agreed. He made a clear commitment that after January the 13th, 2013, Foundation Day, UC Japan would no longer bear financial responsibility for the worldwide movement. That is why, for years, Reverend Moon requested his son, Dr. Moon, to take charge of the movement's businesses and to create an international foundation that would consolidate and rationalize the dispersed global assets of the movement under a single accountable umbrella. The plan was straightforward. Take control of the movement's businesses, turn them profitable, and let those profits fund God's providence. However, a cabal composed of Shan Moon, Kukjin Moon, Mrs. Hak Jahan, and top UC leaders could not accept this because it would mean the dismantling of the Unification Church and the building of a new global order rooted in the providential vision of blessed central families being the building blocks of God's kingdom of heaven on earth. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, UC Japan was raising roughly $300 million a year, mostly from members' donations. Of that staggering amount, about one-third, approximately $100 million every single year, was being poured into a constellation of failing business ventures created and maintained by clerics Dong Moon Ju and Bo Hee Pak in UCI. These were businesses that were supposed to make money for the Providence. They were supposed to free the Japanese membership from carrying the entire global movement on its back. Instead, year after year, decade after decade, they were a bottomless drain. The Providence was subsidizing the businesses, not the other way around. Reverend Moon knew it. It was one of his great unresolved headaches, and he wanted it fixed. That is why every year from the moment Dr. Moon graduated from Harvard Business School, his father asked him to take charge of the movement's businesses and clean up the mess. Dr. Moon never refused. He judged correctly that the movement had more urgent issues to attend to first. When he began his public mission in 1998, the movement was reeling. Nansuk Hong's book had landed like a bomb. The second generation were leaving in alarming numbers, and the broader movement was stagnating. Dr. Moon threw himself into rebuilding the movement from the inside out, and he did it around a single, powerful, and clarifying purpose. Dr. Moon is the person who made it clear that the point of our movement was to establish one family under God, one family at a time. Not to grow a church or to perpetuate a religious institution, but to realize God's ideal family on earth, household by household, generation by generation. That orientation gave blessed families a relevance and a centrality they had been losing. And one family under God became the organizing principle behind every reform and activity that Dr. Moon carried out. From that orientation and foundation, he revitalized the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification and built up the Universal Peace Federation prior to the schism. He built the youth movement that became the engine of growth for the entire movement through 2008, including World CARP, the World Culture and Sports Festival, the Youth Federation for World Peace, and he built up many other crucial entities. Through World CARP, he equipped young people with vision and perspective to become leaders of character who could live for the greater good. He overhauled the Special Task Force program, developed a leadership pipeline, and built a 7-year course of training designed to raise the next generation as owners of God's dream rather than spectators of someone else's. He launched Service for Peace to put the culture of living for the sake of others into practice on the ground. Every one of these initiatives was aligned in the same direction, and every one of them served the same end goal of one family under God. Across the organizations he led, Dr. Moon built foundations from the ground up in every sector of society. Networks of leaders, the ambassadors for peace among them, coalesced around the vision of one family under God and carried it into politics, faith communities, education, and civic life on every continent. Dr. Moon mapped out strategic goals for each organization, clarified the end goal, and drove that clarity into every initiative until each one knew exactly what it was for and how it fit. The clarity that each organization was advancing the goal of establishing one family under God is what allowed these organizations to reach heights none of them had reached before. By 2006, the foundation was in place to launch something larger. Dr. Moon was leading the movement out of its religious box and transforming it into a global, interfaith, intercultural movement because he and his father both understood the messianic mission is to manifest itself on a civilizational level. Blessed families had reason to hope again. Our foundations around the world were growing and being recognized in mainstream society. For the first time in its history, the second generation were animated with energy and purpose. Dr. Moon's Inheritance and Development speech tours and other world tours reached members and blessed children across the movement, pulled an entire generation back from the brink, brought in new members, and took the movement mainstream. By the mid-2000s, it was clear his work had mostly succeeded. The second-generation education framework was in place. The movement was on a new course, and Dr. Moon could finally turn his attention to the financial overhaul his father had been asking him to take on for years. In 2006, when Dr. Moon became chairman of UCI, his father formally placed him in charge of all the businesses and financial institutions of the movement. That meant UCI, the Tongil Foundation, the Park One project in Yoido, and everything else. As mentioned earlier, Reverend Moon also instructed him to create an international foundation that would consolidate the movement's dispersed global assets under a single accountable umbrella, bringing an end to the parasitic relationship between failing businesses and the Japanese membership, and putting the providence on a sustainable footing for the first time in its history. This was exactly the threat the entrenched UC leadership had been dreading. Real reform meant accountability, and accountability meant the end of their unchecked control over the movement's money. So they did what entrenched bureaucracies always do when a reformer arrives. They moved to install figureheads they could operate through. Even before the schism, church leaders had concluded that they could not manipulate or control Dr. Moon. He would never bless their project of building an institutionalized church with themselves at the center, drawing salaries in perpetuity from the Japanese membership. So they turned to the sons within Reverend Moon's family who they could manipulate. Sean was approached first. The clerics understood he would serve as a useful religious face. Sean was then used to bring in Kukjin, whose jealousy of his older brother and ambition for position made him useful to them. With Mrs. Han's active support, they formed the cabal which launched a coordinated global propaganda campaign to elevate the two younger brothers in the eyes of the membership. Their accomplishments were highly inflated. Their stature was manufactured. Beginning around 2005, the clerics started promoting a false, quote, three sons, unquote, framework designed to dilute Dr. Moon's Adamic authority by raising Sean and Kukjin to a seemingly comparable spiritual standing they had never earned and Reverend Moon had never acknowledged. They were sowing the seeds of what would eventually become a full-blown schism. Sean was sold to the members as a genius religious leader. Kukjin was packaged as a business genius who should be entrusted with the movement's enterprises. The truth was the inverse of both claims. Reverend Moon had explicitly said that Kukjin should not be put in charge of any business because the trouble he was already causing in Korea over the Park One project. Those troubles told Reverend Moon everything he needed to know about Kukjin's judgment and motives. Mrs. Han, however, was adamant, and her reasons went well beyond a mother's affection for her son. The three sons framework the cabal had been promoting could not survive on propaganda alone. It needed institutional cover. If Sean and Kukjin were going to be sold to the membership as figures of comparable stature to Dr. Moon, they needed real positions, titles, and authority over entities. Without that, their fake three sons framework would not work. Putting Kukchin in charge of the Tongyo Foundation would help the cabal to chip away at Dr. Moon's standing as Reverend Moon's spiritual heir and Adamic figure. Each member of the cabal had their own reasons for the role they played in the schism. Mrs. Han's reason in time became the largest of all. She intended to hijack the entire movement for herself. Mrs. Han pushed hard for Kukchin to be given a position in the Tongyo Foundation. The pressure came to a head one night in 2006 after Reverend Moon had given the responsibility over the Park One project to Dr. Moon and had sharply rebuked Kukchin, who was on the verge of leaving in protest. That same night, Mrs. Han came to Dr. Moon's room and begged him to make Kukchin head of the Tongyo Foundation. Dr. Moon told her she should get Reverend Moon's permission first. She refused. To preserve peace in the family, Dr. Moon relented on conditions. He asked his mother to make a promise before God that Kukchin would support him as the older brother, that Kukchin would recognize the International Foundation under Dr. Moon, and that Kukchin would never interfere with the Park One project. She gave her word on all three conditions. The next day, she reneged on every one of them. The minute Kukchin took the Tongyo Foundation, trouble began. He immediately moved to hijack the Park One project in direct violation of the promise Mrs. Han had just made. Kukchin worked with the cabal to use legal control as a weapon to seize power and foment the schism. Our movement was built on the spiritual authority and goodwill that flows from the Adamic figure, not from legal control. For the better part of 50 years, that was the operative principle. Members aligned with Reverend Moon because they recognize the messianic mantle he carried, and that authority was later carried by his son, Dr. Moon, as the fourth Adam. Kukchin disregarded that order. Together with his mother, with Shan, and the clerical cabal around them, he treated spiritual authority as something to be supplanted by legal control, launching what is best described as a mad dash for board control across the movement's entities. Dr. Moon's brothers traded on their status as Reverend Moon's family members for credibility. Reverend Moon was thoroughly excluded from their plans, and none of it could have been done without Mrs. Han's total support. The cabal's legal control strategy served as a way to centralize institutional church power and lock it down. Every board the cabal captured, every corporate title they assumed, validated and reinforced the same message that the church institution was the rightful seat of authority, and that the men holding its offices were the rightful holders of that authority. Members did not push back because the clerics had spent years conditioning them to believe in the centrality of the church. But this was a profound departure from everything our movement had ever been. The unification movement was never built on bylaws and board resolutions. It was a charismatic, messianic, providential movement led by an Adamic figure, and its real authority flowed from that source. As we will see, the structures the cabal built during that period of schism most consequentially the Mission Foundation, through which UC Japan's massive financial flows were diverted out of UCI's reach and into entities the cabal controlled. These are the very structures that have now ensnared Mrs. Han in her current legal crisis. Corruption is only one dimension of the criminal exposure now unfolding. The more serious dimension is embezzlement, the use of church or charitable assets to fund personal lifestyles, family contracts, palace extravagance, and political spending. Korea's embezzlement laws are unusually strict, which obviously creates huge liability issues. The cabal built the architecture of legal control to seize the movement, but that same architecture is now the source of their criminal liability. Today, Shan and Kukjin curse their mother, but they would never have enjoyed any position or status in the church without her cover. For them, UCI was a particular obsession, and their reason had nothing to do with legitimacy. It was that the Park One assets had been placed inside UCI. With their legal control strategy in motion, the cabal moved to cut off the financial oxygen Dr. Moon would need to execute his father's directive of rationalizing and reforming the movement's many business entities. Led by Kukjin, the cabal reactivated a dormant organization found only on paper in Korea, the Mission Foundation. Today, it has been rebranded as the Hyojeong Global Tongil Foundation. They installed Mrs. Han as its legal chairperson, with Peter Kim as vice chair. Then, as mentioned earlier, in a preemptive move, they redirected the Japanese donations that had been earmarked for UCI away from the international foundation that Dr. Moon was building, and they sent it into the Mission Foundation they controlled. Kukjin was placed as leader over Japan as well, so that the cabal now controlled both ends of the pipeline, the source of the money in Japan and its destination in Korea. The choice of Korea as the legal home for this entity was itself a disaster in its own right, and any competent advisor should have flagged it immediately. Korea is among the worst possible jurisdictions in the world for an international foundation of this size. Korea lacks the strong corporate veil and director protections, as well as the religious freedoms that exist in other developed jurisdictions, such as the United States. And Korea has unusually aggressive embezzlement and anti-corruption statutes, the very statutes under which Mrs. Han could become criminally entangled. By placing her name on the chairperson position of an entity moving hundreds of millions of dollars through one of the harshest regulatory environments on earth, Shan, Kukjin, and the rest of the cabal were quietly setting the legal trap that would later close on Mrs. Han. This was also a nefarious strike against Dr. Moon, because they were trying to make Reverend Moon's directive impossible for him to execute, and they forced the elevation of a rival power structure with Dr. Moon's mother as its public face. It worked twice over. It captured the money, and it handed the UC leaders a propaganda weapon, because from that day forward, any move Dr. Moon made to recover what his father had assigned him could be reframed as a son attacking his mother. It was cynical and reckless and evil. Every legal protection carefully built up after Danbury to shield Reverend Moon and his wife from personal liability was now set aside. The clerics and the siblings put Mrs. Hahn as chairperson of an entity they were using as a money conduit, and they did it without, apparently, a single serious thought about the tremendous danger they were placing Mrs. Hahn under. If Mrs. Hahn sits in a Korean jail today, it is because her two sons, Shan and Kukjin, as well as the leaders around her, created the structure that would put her there. Nothing makes the UC leaders' motives clearer than what they did to UCI. To understand what they did, you first have to understand the financial reality Dr. Moon inherited when he became UCI chairman in 2006. Recall that UCI was being kept afloat by roughly $100 million a year in subsidies from UC Japan, almost all of it flowing into the sinkhole of failing businesses built by Bohee Pak and later made worse by his successor, Dong Moon-ju. Restructuring UCI, cleaning up Pak and Ju's mess, and turning those businesses profitable was going to require sustained funding during the restructuring process. Dr. Moon had a plan for exactly that. It was what his father had asked him to execute. The top UC leaders knew it, and that is precisely why they moved to cut the subsidy off. Peter Kim sat on the board of UCI. So did Dong Moon-ju. Both men had a fiduciary duty to the entity they served. Both men knew better than anyone how fragile UCI's finances were and how much was riding on the Japan subsidy continuing through the restructuring. Through his efforts, Dr. Moon was drastically reducing the reliance on subsidies within UCI. Yet, within the span of a few months between 2008 and 2009, with Kukjin's help, they completely shut down all financial support from Japan. By any ordinary measure, that should have been a death sentence, and UCI should have collapsed, and that was their plan. Peter Kim helped redirect the UCI-bound funds to the Mission Foundation in Korea, the same entity mentioned earlier, where Mrs. Han was made chairperson and Peter Kim was vice chair. Consider what that actually means. A board member of UCI, legally obligated to act in UCI's interest, was simultaneously the chief operating officer of the entity that was hijacking UCI's money. It is a textbook conflict of interest, executed deliberately by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Ju went further. As head of Washington Times Aviation, a UCI subsidiary, he siphoned $21 million out of WTA's bank account and rerouted it to the Mission Foundation in Korea. The point was to make UCI default. The UC leaders understood that if they could starve UCI into collapse on Dr. Moon's watch, they would have their political weapon, proof, they would claim, that the son Reverend Moon had recognized as his heir could not run the movement's businesses and had squandered what he had been given, which was a total lie. After the schism started, they were willing to burn down an entity Reverend Moon had built up an entity carrying the Washington Times and some of the most strategically important assets of the global movement, just to score points against Dr. Moon. That is the level of recklessness and evil we are talking about. That is how far they were prepared to go. Having created the crisis themselves, the cabal turned around and used that crisis to attack the man trying to save UCI from their sabotage. Again, Washington Times Aviation, or WTA, is a UCI subsidiary company. When WTA's board did exactly what every corporate board on earth is legally required to do, which was to formally request the return of improperly transferred company funds of WTA to the Mission Foundation, the cabal saw their opening to publicly criticize Dr. Moon. These UC leaders did not explain the issue of fiduciary duties. They did not explain the $21 million taken out recklessly and illegally by Jew. They did not explain that Dr. Moon, as UCI chairman, had his own fiduciary obligations he was legally bound to uphold. Instead, they told Korean society through a coordinated and vicious media campaign that Dr. Moon was suing his mother. In a culture where filial piety is sacred, that lie was devastating. It was meant to destroy Dr. Moon's reputation in Korea. And every piece of communication coming out of the church portrayed Dr. Moon as an ungrateful son attacking his mother. The truth was simpler and far less interesting. A board of directors was recovering stolen funds, and its chairman was doing what the law required. The courts eventually agreed and ordered the funds returned to WTA. But by then, the damage was already done, and the cabal had exactly what they had wanted. They manufactured a financial crisis at UCI by cutting off the subsidy that kept the businesses afloat. They installed Mrs. Han as the legal face of the entity, receiving the diverted money, exposing her to enormous personal liability in one of the worst possible jurisdictions on earth. The cabal then gaslit Dr. Moon as an unfilial son for fulfilling his fiduciary duty, knowing full well that was exactly what he was doing. And they did all of this for one reason: to destroy the reputation of the heir that Reverend Moon had recognized. In 2011, Sean led the next escalation and dragged the Unification Church into a lawsuit against Dr. Moon and UCI in Washington, D.C. 15 years and hundreds of millions of dollars in legal fees later, that case is finally over. Dr. Moon and UCI won it all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. Hundreds of millions of dollars, blood money raised on the backs of Japanese members, burned up in American courtrooms by people who insisted they were implementing Reverend Moon's directive. And yet, against every odd that was stacked against him, Dr. Moon kept UCI alive. He created value and restructured UCI. Through what can only be described as a Herculean effort, he turned things around and made those businesses profitable. Dr. Moon did not lose a single one of the many lawsuits brought against him or his associates. The cabal's attempt to hijack UCI failed, but the cost to UC Japan and to the reputation of our movement is incalculable. In trying to destroy Dr. Moon, the church leaders destroyed Reverend Moon's own reputation every lawsuit, asset seizure, and attack on his son was carried out under the same banner, that this was his father's direction. The cabal insisted on that. The cabal told members and the world that the lawsuits, the takeovers, and the public denunciations all flowed from Reverend Moon himself, directed against the very son he had recognized as his heir and who had led the movement alongside Reverend Moon for a decade. None of that was true. It was manufactured, every piece of it. And the one who condoned and actively supported that campaign was Mrs. Han. Whenever the cabal invoked, quote, the direction of the true parents, unquote, what it really meant is that it was Mrs. Han's direction. Reverend Moon's name was being used to execute things he had never authorized. But once that banner was raised, Reverend Moon was the one left holding the consequences. Members who took the clerics at their word should have tried to make sense of what they were being told. They should have thought, what kind of father directs his lieutenants to sue his own son over money, position, and authority? What kind of Messiah signs off on the public destruction of his designated heir? What kind of founder of a movement built on the ideal family conducts a multi-year legal war against his own family member? The cost of these contradictions did not land on the clerics who manufactured all those lies, but on Reverend Moon, whom they wore on their sleeves and used to legitimize their actions. This is why the damage outlasts everyone involved. Reverend Moon's reputation was damaged. His wife is now in prison. The Unification Church's standing in the world is in ruins. While UCI was being financially starved, another operation was being scaled up. In Cheongpyeong, Hyo-nam Kim called Hunmo and Daemonim within the church and claiming to channel Mrs. Han's deceased mother, built up and institutionalized one of the most exploitative grifts in the history of our movement, the so-called ancestral liberation workshops. What had started small prior to the schism was mainstreamed through Shan and church leaders during the time of the schism, once the leadership realized how reliably it could extract money from obedient members. The drum beating, chanting, self-flagellating theatrics, the hands laid on members' bodies to drive out spirits, all of it was normalized, exported worldwide, and tied directly to a payment schedule. As usual, Japanese members would suffer the brunt of this new scam. It was made to exploit them. The pitch was simple and a lie. Pay money and your ancestors will be liberated. Pay more and your written wish on an expensive piece of paper will become true. Sell your house, buy a miniature pagoda, and you will own a home in the spirit world. Every one of these claims is wholly unsupported by the divine principle. The truth is, they flatly contradict the principle. These are the textbook definition of indulgences, as disproved by the Protestant Reformation. Hyo-nam Kim, the architect of this racket, was eventually thrown out by Mrs. Han herself for allegedly stealing huge sums of money from the movement. The woman who built Cheongpyeong as a money machine was the inn herself too greedy even for the people who were profiting from her. And your leaders never told the membership. They are still not telling them. That silence tells you everything you need to know about who they really serve. And the scam did not end when Yonam Kim was pushed out. Today, the Unification Church still runs ancestral liberation as one of its central revenue streams, now under the UC cleric Ki-sung Lee. If anything, the operation has been refined. Over the years, the clerics layered on more generations of ancestors to liberate, more ceremonies to attend, more products to purchase, and more price tiers to climb. In every continent, this is now one of the single largest sources of money flowing into UC coffers. Inside Japan, the leadership was never monolithic. There were two basic tracks, embodied by two men. Motu Furuta was the architect of spiritual sales, the high-pressure, deceptive fundraising that became Japan's public scandal. Takeru Kamiyama stood for spiritual orientation, for caring for members rather than draining them. At the time of the schism, Furuta followed Kukjin. Mr. Kamiyama came to Dr. Moon's side. This matters because the question of who actually destroyed UC Japan is a matter of public record. The root cause was the unprincipled actions of UC's own leaders, leaders who attacked the true Adamic authority instead of supporting it as Reverend Moon had directed. And leaders in Japan, these Korean national and regional leaders, who continued year after year the illicit public fundraising and the horrendous treatment of blessed families that drove household after household into bankruptcy. Talk to any blessed family in Japan. Ask them who hurt them worst over the past decades, the media, the government, or their own leaders. The truthful answer will be the same every time. The Japanese blessed families are victims of UC leaders. And the strategy of the UC clerics has been and remains to blame the media and the government, most of all blaming Dr. Moon, while ignoring the members' suffering and just hoping it goes away. Dr. Moon opposed both the spiritual sales in Japan and the payment of money for ancestral liberation, and he opposed them as part of a larger vision. As they advanced in the Messianic mission, Reverend Moon and his son, Dr. Moon, were ushering in the end of the church era, where God's providence was moving past the institutional church model, and blessed families were being called to take ownership of their own faith, centered on the divine principle and on God's providence directly, rather than through intermediaries who extracted money in exchange for spiritual outcomes. In that vision, blessed families would live their lives to the fullest, raise children of goodness, and freely donate to the providence where they saw fit. They did not need to buy a pagoda to secure a home in the spirit world. They did not need to purchase the liberation of their ancestors from a church leader. They needed simply to live and practice the principle in their lives. What UC leaders like Furuta were running in Japan was the exploitation of a specific vulnerability in Japanese religious culture. The long-standing tradition in which items are purchased for health, for luck, for the fortune of one's children, or for the removal of bad spirits. This tradition is referred to as Reikon Shoho, or spiritual sales. UC leaders took an existing cultural tendency and exploited it, building workshops, products, and donation tiers around it. The purpose was to generate the maximum possible volume of donations from a population whose cultural instincts had been trained over centuries to associate money with spiritual protection. Dr. Moon wanted this ended, but the clerics wanted it expanded because it was the single most efficient money extraction engine. Almost 2 decades before Prime Minister Abe was killed, Dr. Moon already knew what was happening in Japan. Eyewitnesses and even self-proclaimed church historian Michael Mickler, in the book 40 Years in America, confirmed that Dr. Moon conducted fact-finding trips, met senior and youth leaders, and ordered investigations into the abuses. The investigations confirmed the worst. He then removed some 24 Korean regional leaders from their positions for their actions in Japan. He also directed regional leaders of Japan to attend a 21-day workshop in Canada. I was there. I saw it. On the first day, he stood them up and told them plainly, "You do not go back to Japan. You will stay here and work with me, and I will make you into good leaders." The workshop was part of Dr. Moon's attempts to reform the movement. It could have changed history, but it was all undone by a lie. Jung Ok-yu, then national leader of Japan, went directly to Dr. Moon's father and told him a lie. Jung Ok-yu told Reverend Moon if those Korean regional leaders were removed, the entire Japanese fundraising operation would collapse. This was not true. But Reverend Moon, on the basis of that lie, reinstated them. And with that reinstatement, the door was nailed shut on reform in Japan, leading instead to 2 more decades of suffering, of bankrupted families, and ultimately to Shinzo Abe's assassination. Jung Ok-yu, fittingly, later became one of the chief apologists for Shan Moon and his sanctuary church. When they were in charge of the UC, Shan and Kukjin embraced the Japanese spiritual sales model as the ideal form of fundraising, and they wanted to set it up in every nation. Furuta had been dismissed because his fundraising tactics blew up into a public scandal. He was replaced by Mr. Kamiyama, who was given directions to clean up Furuta's mess. But during the schism, Kukjin brought Furuta back. The cabal had Furuta installed as president of True World Group and turned him loose. From 2009 onward, the pressure on Japanese members reached levels that Dr. Moon and his father had explicitly forbidden. The cabal's goal was to squeeze every last yen out of Japan to fund the bigger, more institutional church that they wanted to control. Takeshi Yashiro, a top True World Group executive, aligned with Furuta, became one of the loudest attackers of Dr. Moon, leading Japanese members in the United States out of True World Group in large numbers. In February 2011, at the cabal's request, Furuta and Yashiro required some 100 TWG managers to go to Las Vegas under the false pretense that Reverend Moon wanted to meet with them. The cabal's intent was to force a situation and create the impression of a clash between Dr. Moon and his father by taking advantage of the respect the managers had for Reverend Moon. The cabal made this calculated abuse of faith for their own political benefit, so that the managers would leave their TWG business duties, violating company protocol and policy. The cabal's aim was to have Reverend Moon condemn his son, Dr. Moon, in front of all the managers. But Reverend Moon did not go along with their insidious scheme. When Reverend Moon saw the managers, he asked, "Why are you here?" Because he had never called them in the first place. Reverend Moon refused to condemn Dr. Moon, even as Furuta tried to prompt him by talking negatively about his son. Actually, Reverend Moon told Furuta, quote, "Do not drive a wedge between me and my son." UC Japan, at its peak, generated roughly $300 million a year. From 1998 onward, whenever Dr. Moon personally visited Japan, he inspired members so much that donations there rose by approximately 30%. That is, by something on the order of $90 million per visit cycle. The man the church leaders spent 2 decades trying to destroy was, by their own internal numbers, the single most effective, inspirational figure their fundraising had ever had. They knew it. They wanted to get rid of him anyway. While that money was pouring in, what was Hyeonam Kim doing in Chungpyeong? She was buying a golf course in Sokcho. She was setting up extravagant businesses owned by herself and her son. The Ancestral Liberation Operation was a scam, and the proceeds of the scam went into the pockets of the cabal running it. Mrs. Han eventually came to understand this, but only after the looting had been going on for years. What was Kukjin doing while he ran the Tongyo Foundation and oversaw UC Japan? Does anyone seriously believe that money did not flow into his own business ventures? It would be astonishing if there were not hidden funds. Korean leaders love to do speaking tours of Japanese churches for one simple reason. They walked out of every church with envelopes full of cash. It was a grift conducted on top of a membership that was already being bled dry, and it accelerated UC Japan's collapse rather than relieving it. Most of UC Japan's funds were supposed to be earmarked for UCI, for the providential purposes Reverend Moon had assigned to Dr. Moon. Instead, Kukjin and Peter Kim diverted them to the Mission Foundation. If even a fraction of that money had reached UCI, the painful asset sales of the past decade by UCI would never have been necessary. What did the cabal do with the providential money they diverted? Japanese and Korean media have reported that roughly $42 million of Japanese donation funds were spent on gambling in Las Vegas over a 3-year period. That is $14 million a year, 4 to 5% of UC Japan's entire annual fundraising gambled away in casinos. Not from business profits, from donations. Donations raised from Japanese families. That window we know about runs only from 2008 to 2011. We have no public accounting so far of what happened from 2012 through 2025. Imagine what the number most likely is. What kind of person does this with money raised in the name of God? Mrs. Han, meanwhile, was being flown to Hawaii and Las Vegas with her leaders year after year after year. On March 4th, 2026, the Tokyo High Court affirmed the dissolution of the Unification Church of Japan. In the opinion accompanying its ruling, the court did exactly what this piece has been asking Unification members to do. It followed the money. What the court found is that after 2009, the Unification Church in Japan, under the cabal's leadership, continued the practice of spiritual sales despite public promises to stop. The court found that the operation did not shrink in the years that followed. Instead, it grew. The church made more money through these tactics after it had pledged to abandon them than it had before. And the court found that roughly 90% of those funds were sent to Korea. Mrs. Han never fully understood the legal jeopardy she was being placed in when she was made head of the Mission Foundation. The leaders who put her in danger probably did not understand it either. They were not competent enough for the positions they had grabbed. They should never have been there in the first place. The consequences are now upon all of them and upon Mrs. Han. They put her in front. She is the one in jail. And for all their theological posturing, these are not people who actually care about doctrine. They promote the only begotten daughter theology to members with a straight face while pretending to honor Reverend Moon. For them, religion is just a facade, a means to control members and secure their next month's paycheck. Meanwhile, in Japan, the church that spent decades pillaging its own members is finished. UC Japan is over. News reports state that the leadership has been trying to spin up a new entity to receive assets and continue operations, and that effort has failed. The Tokyo High Court has spoken. The liquidator controls the church now. All worship is suspended. The spiritual consequences for those who opposed and attacked the Adamic figure are undeniable. This is heavenly judgment. To members, you have been lied to for a long time by people who needed you to keep giving so they could keep taking from you. The Japanese blessed families were the real victims of their own leaders. The Chungpyeong indulgences are a racket. The supposed, quote, lawsuit against mother, unquote, that church leaders claimed was initiated by Dr. Moon was actually a fiduciary board recovering stolen funds. The schism was not Dr. Moon disobeying his parents. It was Dr. Moon staying true to God's providence and carrying on his father's messianic work as the true heir and Adamic figure, while being attacked for it by a group of people whose only real concern was holding on to power and to money. Walk away from any leader who asks you to fund the next palace, buy the next pagoda, sign up for the next ancestral liberation, or ask you to attack the man Reverend Moon recognized as the fourth Adam. Follow the money. It will tell you who you have been serving. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Please stay tuned for the next episode of Anti-Liars, where we promise to always seek the truth and dispel the lies. God bless you and your family.